Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most dramatic and tense developments in Eastern Europe. Right now, the growing signs that Belarusian generals are turning against Alexander Lukashenko and how this could push his long-standing regime right to the edge. This is not just another political story. It's about the cracks appearing inside one of the most authoritarian systems in Europe. A regime that has held on to power for nearly 3 decades through control, fear, and manipulation. Lukashenko, often called Europe's last dictator, has ruled Belarus since 1994. For years, he's managed to maintain control through a mixture of propaganda, intimidation, and an iron grip on state institutions. He built his power around loyalty, especially from the army and the security services, but that loyalty may be starting to fade. Recent reports, internal leaks, and even whispers from within military circles suggest that some of the generals, once his most trusted protectors, are growing uneasy. To understand why this matters, we need to remember how dependent Lukashenko's regime is on the loyalty of the armed forces. In a country where free elections and independent courts barely exist, the army and internal security forces are the real backbone of power. They keep protesters off the streets, silence dissent, and ensure that orders from above are obeyed. When such a pillar begins to weaken, the entire structure can start to crumble. So what's driving this change among the generals? One key reason is exhaustion. After decades of following the same orders, repressing their own people, and watching the regime become increasingly isolated, many in the military have started to question what they're fighting for. The brutal crackdown on protests in 2020 left deep scars, not just among civilians, but within the security forces themselves. Some officers privately admitted they were uncomfortable with what they were asked to do to beat and imprison fellow citizens whose only crime was demanding free elections. Another reason is the war in Ukraine. Belarus has been drawn into Russia's orbit more deeply than ever before. Lukashenko allowed Russian troops to use Belarusian territory to invade Ukraine in 2022. This decision angered many officers who saw it as a betrayal of Belarus's sovereignty. They didn't sign up to become pawns in Moscow's war. For many in the military, the idea of being forced into direct combat alongside Russian forces, or against Ukraine, a neighboring country with which Belarusians have deep cultural and personal ties, is unacceptable. The generals also understand the political risk. Aligning too closely with Putin's Russia means tying their fate to a power that may not come to their rescue when things go wrong. If Lukashenko falls, those who backed him unconditionally could find themselves isolated, sanctioned, or even prosecuted. Some in the military leadership may already be looking for ways to distance themselves, to protect their own futures in a post-Lukashenko Belarus. Economic decline adds another layer to this crisis. Sanctions, corruption, and state mismanagement have drained the country's resources. The once relatively stable Belarusian economy has become increasingly dependent on Russian subsidies. Soldiers' salaries are shrinking, budgets are being cut, and morale is falling. When loyalty no longer pays, loyalty begins to waver. Inside Lukashenko's inner circle, paranoia is growing. He reportedly reshuffles his top security personnel constantly, afraid that any one of them could become too powerful or too ambitious. This kind of distrust poisons the atmosphere in any regime. When everyone is watching their back, genuine loyalty disappears. What remains is fear, and fear is a weak foundation for power. There have been several subtle but telling signs of division. Some generals have quietly retired earlier than expected. Others have been reassigned to less influential posts. A few have even fled the country, joining the opposition movement abroad. The fact that ranking officers are choosing exile over obedience is a strong indicator of how fragile things have become. The Belarusian opposition, though still under intense pressure, has taken notice. Figures like Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who represents the democratic movement in exile, have been reaching out to potential defectors within the regime. They promise amnesty and inclusion in a future government to those willing to turn their backs on Lukashenko. This kind of messaging, combined with growing discontent inside the country, is starting to resonate with parts of the military establishment. Meanwhile, Russia is watching closely. For the Kremlin, Belarus is a crucial ally and a strategic buffer between Russia and NATO. A collapse of Lukashenko's regime could be disastrous for Moscow's influence in the region. That's why Putin has provided economic aid, military backing, and political support to keep Lukashenko afloat. But even Russia has its limits. If the Belarusian leadership becomes too unstable or too costly to support, the Kremlin could start considering alternatives. This creates a dangerous situation for Belarus. If Lukashenko loses control of his generals, Moscow might try to intervene directly, either to install a more compliant figure or to secure military assets on Belarusian soil. Such a move would deepen Belarus's loss of sovereignty and could even trigger international confrontation. Within Belarus, ordinary citizens sense the change. The once all-powerful image of Lukashenko has faded. His speeches sound defensive, filled with talk of enemies and conspiracies. He blames the West, the opposition, and even elements within his own government for the country's troubles. But this constant blame game only reveals his growing insecurity. People are no longer afraid in the same way they once were. When authoritarian regimes begin to weaken, they often double down on repression. We're already seeing this in Belarus. New laws criminalize even small acts of dissent, from social media posts to displaying banned symbols. But history shows that repression can only go so far. The more pressure the government applies, the more resentment builds up beneath the surface. At some point, the fear barrier breaks. If the generals truly begin to defect, it could happen quietly at first. Orders might be delayed, missions misinterpreted, or resources lost. Then, as confidence grows, the dissent could become open public statements, resignations, refusals to follow directives. Such cracks can spread rapidly in systems built on loyalty. Once a few high-ranking figures defect, others follow to avoid being on the losing side. Lukashenko's options are narrowing. He can try to purge the ranks, but doing so risks creating more enemies. He can lean even more heavily on Russia, but that means giving up what little independence Belarus still has. He can attempt reform, but that would undermine his entire narrative of strength and control. In every direction, there are dangers. The question now is not if his regime is weakening, it's how quickly and how dramatically the collapse could come. The history of authoritarian governments tells us that such systems can appear solid one day and crumble the next. The speed of change often surprises everyone, even the insiders. Still, a complete collapse is not guaranteed. Some elements of the military and police remain fiercely loyal to Lukashenko. They fear chaos, revenge, and loss of privilege more than they dislike the regime itself. These loyalists could keep the regime afloat for a while longer, especially if Russia steps in with more aid or personnel. Yet the longer this stalemate lasts, the more pressure builds within the system. Every economic shock, every act of defiance, every whisper of disobedience from within the army adds weight to the possibility of change. Lukashenko has spent decades creating a political machine built entirely around himself. But in doing so, he has also ensured that if he falls, the entire structure collapses with him. The international community is watching carefully but cautiously. Western governments have imposed sanctions and voiced support for the opposition, but direct intervention remains unlikely. Most countries fear that aggressive action could push Belarus even deeper into Russia's control. Instead, they are waiting, offering moral and logistical support to democratic forces and preparing for possible change. For the Belarusian people, the stakes are enormous. A post-Lukashenko Belarus could open the door to democracy and freedom, but it could also lead to instability or external interference. Much depends on how the military behaves in the coming months. If the generals act responsibly, prioritizing the nation over the ruler, Belarus could transition peacefully. If not, the risk of violence remains real. Inside Lukashenko's inner circle, the fear of betrayal runs deep. He is said to be monitoring his generals personally, rotating security chiefs, and relying more on personal guards and Russian advisors. Such moves only highlight his growing isolation. The strongman who once projected absolute confidence now seems haunted by the possibility of betrayal at every corner. There's a psychological aspect to this too. Leaders like Lukashenko often believe their own propaganda, that they are indispensable, that the people love them, that the army would never turn against them. When the first signs of disloyalty appear, they tend to react with shock, denial, and anger. This emotional volatility can accelerate the fall. The turning of generals is not just a political event, it's a symbolic one. It shows that fear is no longer absolute, that power can be questioned from within. When the protectors stop protecting, the ruler stands alone. In that moment, even the most entrenched autocracy can unravel. Belarus stands at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into repression and dependence on Moscow. The other leads toward possible freedom, though it won't be easy or quick. The courage of the military, whether they choose the nation or the dictator, will likely decide the outcome. If the generals truly turn against Lukashenko, it could mark the beginning of the end for one of Europe's last authoritarian strongholds. But if they hesitate, if fear once again wins out, the cycle of repression could continue for years. Either way, the days of total control appear numbered. The regime is no longer unshakable. It's trembling at the edges, caught between its past and an uncertain future. The people of Belarus have shown extraordinary resilience. They've faced violence, prison, and exile, yet their spirit remains unbroken. They continue to hope for a day when their country will be free from fear, when their voices will matter again. And maybe, just maybe, the cracks within the regime are the first signs that their patience is about to be rewarded. As we watch events unfold, one thing is clear. The turning of generals against Lukashenko is more than a political crisis. It's a moment of truth for Belarus, a test of loyalty, courage, and destiny. Whether the regime falls tomorrow or years from now, the process has begun. The illusion of absolute control has shattered, and from that fracture, history is beginning to move. Thanks for watching.